2 years had passed since the death of my wife. She was taken from me by the ruinous powers, tempted by the slick tongue of a heretic disguised as a traveling salesman. She was given a set of bracelets that cursed her and turned her away from the light of the Emperor. At first I was overjoyed by her newfound powers. She looked happy when she was able to move objects with her mind. She claimed that she would ask 2 invisible angels to please move things around the house, and they would happily oblige. The angels never existed. This was just her way of rationalizing that she was a psyker. But then she started doing weird things, like when she explained that one of the angels really loves sugar cubes, so she would leave them out for it to eat in the middle of the night. It was strange, but the reality was that the sugar cubes would be gone every morning. She started to tell me that the angels would tell her of future events, that they would tell her what would happen depending on what choices she would make that day. She even was able to save poor little Daphne from falling down a well. Her angels were guiding her, and she trusted them. Just like me, of course. No one believed her when she started telling others of her angels. I told her to stop talking about things like that to people around the town. People were starting to whisper that she was going crazy. Then one day, right after Saturday's sermon, she questioned the priest as to why he didn't have any angels of his own, if he was supposedly so close to the Emperor. That's when things really turned for the worst. The priest called his colleagues from the Departamental Ministorum, and they told the Archbishop of my wife's supposed powers. And before we knew it, the whole town was told not to communicate with us until the bishop himself talked to her. My wife didn't care that the townspeople would run every time they would see us coming down the road. She said all she needed was me and her angels. When the bishop showed up in town, he arranged an interview with both of us. 2 minutes into the interview, and the bishop's eyes began to bleed. He was so frightened, he ran out of the town hall. He was screaming, "Witch!" Of course I wanted to protect her, but I couldn't. I watched as they took her away and hung her in the town courtyard. Even though the priest and the bishop said she was possessed by chaos, she was still my wife. I lost the woman I loved. Life was never really the same after her death. I was always treated different by the townspeople, and no one would purchase anything from me. They were scared that my crops were tainted by chaos. I asked the priest for help when I didn't have enough thrones to pay for lumber in the fall. He turned me away. I had to sell our house and move in with relatives in the city. It was cramped living. My cousin could only spare a small room with no windows in one of his rental properties, but it was all I could afford. I became a janitor at a ministorum building and moved my way up to the mailroom within a year. Exactly 2 years after my wife's death, I received a letter at work. The sender was noted as Angels, and the note inside was from my wife. She spoke to me as if she was still alive and back at our country home. She explained how she missed me and how it's been hard not being able to be with me since I left. I crumbled the letter up and threw it in the garbage. Whomever was doing this was a cruel and evil-spirited person. I was glad I was out of that town and away from all those shitty townspeople that probably sent this letter. The following week, I received another letter. It came from the same person, but didn't even bother opening it. What was strange is that I felt like someone was watching me, waiting to see the expression on my face upon opening the letter. I doubted anyone was really watching. Another week passed, and another letter came. This time it was stamped as urgent. I reluctantly opened the letter, and it was her again. As I began to read the letter, it explained how my wife's angel had told her I was crumpling up the letters without reading them. A cold shiver went down my spine. At that moment, I knew someone was watching me. I didn't finish reading the letter. I simply folded it up and put it in my back pocket. The rest of the day, I made sure to keep an eye on everyone. I had to be sure I wasn't being watched by some prankster or malintent former townsperson. When I got back home, I locked myself in my small room and finished reading the letter. My dead wife was asking me to come back home. She said I didn't have to worry about the priest and the townspeople. She would take care of them. She said she missed me and she would be waiting for me back home. I burned the letter. Whatever this was, it was torment. I saw my wife die with my own 2 eyes, and every letter made me relive that day. I had to remind myself that she was truly dead, and there was nothing I could do to get her back, no matter what hope these letters provided. A week later, I was sorting through the mail, hoping not to see another letter from her. And there it was. I didn't open it at all. I simply placed it in my pocket and went back to work. When I got home again, I locked myself in my room and began to read. The letter pleaded me to come back home. My wife said she didn't understand why I would burn her last letter. She wanted to be with me again. I stood in my room in silence, staring at the letter. I was not alone. The feeling of being watched was not my imagination. My wife's angels were in the room with me. At that moment, I made the decision to go visit my old home. After a long journey, I arrived, and I stood there in front of the door of what was once our home. I knocked, but there was no answer. I knew there were people living at the home because I sold it to a man with a family of 6. I was surprised not a single child or even animal came running out. I stepped around the back and noticed that the door was wide open. I knocked again, but went inside. Things were very dusty, as if no one had been living here for quite some time. There was a sound coming from the basement, but the light switch was not turning on the light from upstairs. I walked down the dark stairs, and even though I had done this thousands of times when I lived here, never had I felt this much fear going down in the basement. I took a few steps out, waiting for my eyes to adjust, when I stepped on something that cracked. When I looked down, I was horrified to make out the skeletal remains of a child's leg, its little shoes still on the toddler's feet. I ran towards the steps, but I felt a strong tug on my shirt. I looked back, and deep in the basement, I could make out the silhouette of a dark figure with long hair. It walked towards me, and try as I might, I could not run away. I was being pushed back by some invisible force. When the figure was finally close enough to see, I realized it was my wife. She was as beautiful as the day I first met her. She appeared younger and radiant. She stretched out her arms, and I hugged her as tight as I could. She explained that before her death, her angels went out and pleaded to their master to save her life. While she was gasping for air in the town square on the day of her hanging, all she could think of is the fear of never seeing me again. She was visited by a beautiful goddess who promised to save her so long as she was willing to follow her teachings. My wife accepted the offer and was resurrected on the 300th day after her hanging. But her body was horribly decayed, and the goddess explained to her that she would have to bathe in a mixture of milk and blood. The younger the blood, the more beautiful she would appear. She explained that she no longer had to eat, drink, or sleep. Her body remained pure for 6 days. After the 6th day, she had to bathe again. She explained she had sustained herself by bathing in the blood of the family who lived in our house. But now that they were gone, she needed my help to find new people. There was no way I could do what she was asking me, but if I refused, she explained she would die. She reminded me of how much I hated the townspeople and how they basically drove me out of town, and it was true. And my love for my wife was much stronger than my feeling towards those people that watched as she was taken from me. That's when I realized I was willing to sacrifice every person on this planet so long as she stayed with me for the rest of my life. She was overjoyed and told me she would get help from her angel whenever possible. The first person we sacrificed was my neighbor, old Nam. She lived alone, so the whole thing went over pretty easily. All my wife had to do is have her angel unlock the side door. But it was strange, because my wife always talked about 2 angels when she was alive, but now she only ever mentioned 1. When I asked her what happened to the second angel, She smiled and said she didn't know. It just left and never came back. I also started noticing that she would eat sugar cubes, and it was strange because she specifically told me that she no longer had to eat or drink. When I asked her about it, she just said she liked them a lot. The idea that this woman was not my wife, but a demonic imposter that was the cause of her death, it ate at my mind. But every time I took another body to her, she filled me with a sense of pleasure that I had never felt before. I was falling deeper in love with this woman. I hope you guys enjoyed this creepypasta, and thank you for watching. But with that said, I'll see you tomorrow. This was Gersh1 with One Mind Syndicate, signing out.
Always used to put my freedom first in any situation.